When the war began, the Germans believed no one could match their engineering. They had the best tanks, the most advanced aircraft, and the most precise manufacturing in the world, or so they thought. But by 1943, a stunning realization was spreading through the ranks of German industry and the Luftwaffe's intelligence branches. America was building tanks and planes faster than anyone thought humanly possible. In the early years of the war, the German war machines seemed unstoppable. The Panzer divisions rolled through Europe with terrifying precision. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and the Reich's factories, though limited, produced machines of unmatched quality. Every tank, every Messerschmitt, every U-boat was a symbol of craftsmanship and technological pride, but there was a flaw, a fatal one. Germany built for perfection, America built for scale. When U.S. production began to accelerate in 1942, German analysts could hardly believe the reports. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and California were producing tanks, bombers, and fighter aircraft at rates that defied engineering logic. One intelligence officer famously said, "They build as if the machines are made of wood." He wasn't mocking. He was terrified. By mid-1942, the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Across the country, new assembly lines were churning out Sherman tanks, fighter aircraft, and trucks by the thousands. German engineers, accustomed to handcrafting each vehicle, could not comprehend how such quality could emerge from what they considered crude methods. One Luftwaffe intelligence report described it as a war of machines built by machines. They estimated that the Americans could replace entire divisions' worth of lost equipment in the time it took Germany to build a single batch of new aircraft. Inside Germany, factories were strained. Allied bombings crippled production lines, raw materials ran short, and skilled laborers were drafted into the army. Even the mighty panzer factories of Krupp and Henschel struggled to meet quotas. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's industrial machine ran day and night. Women and men worked 3 shifts. Railcars delivered endless supplies of steel, aluminum, and oil. The numbers were staggering. In 1943 alone, the United States produced over 85,000 aircraft, more than Germany had built in the entire war up to that point. For the first time, German engineers realized they were no longer competing in a war of design. They were trapped in a war of output. Even captured German officers began to admit it. One of them, a former Panzer designer, said during interrogation, "We built machines that lasted forever." They built machines that won the war. That was the difference, and the beginning of Germany's awakening to the industrial power they had underestimated. In the spring of 1943, as German forces fought desperately on the Eastern Front, reports began flooding into Berlin, not from the battlefield, but from industrial spies and captured documents. They described American factories so vast that entire armies could fit inside them. It was a scale of production that defied comprehension. One of the most shocking revelations came from Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan. German intelligence learned that this single facility employed more than 40,000 workers and stretched nearly a mile long. Every hour, a B-24 bomber, weighing more than 18 tons, rolled off its final assembly line. In Germany, it could take weeks to produce one such aircraft. Engineers in Rechlin and Peenemünde, the centers of German aeronautical research, were astounded. Their own designs, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, the Focke-Wulf 190, were masterpieces of precision, but they required skilled labor, handcrafting, and time. The Americans, by contrast, treated planes like cars. Components were standardized, built in separate factories, and assembled like puzzles. It was production by rhythm, not artistry. Captured German airmen, questioned by Allied intelligence, later said that they had underestimated the United States completely. "We believed their machines were simple," one recalled. "Now we see that was their strength." The American industrial system was not just big, it was coordinated. Hundreds of subcontractors worked in harmony, connected by rail, telephone, and the relentless tempo of wartime demand. Every component, every bolt, every gasket could be replaced, duplicated, or mass-produced without delay. In Germany, production had bottlenecks. If one factory was bombed, an entire supply chain could collapse. In America, if one plant went offline, two others picked up the slack. By 1943, the numbers spoke for themselves. American industry produced 48,000 tanks, 86,000 aircraft, and nearly 250,000 military trucks in a single year. The sheer logistical scale was something no Axis power could match. One German industrial analyst wrote in a secret memo, "It is not that their machines are superior, it is that their nation itself has become a factory." This realization struck at the core of German pride. For a country that had prided itself on engineering mastery, the idea that quantity could overcome quality felt unthinkable. Yet on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, and the skies over Europe, that truth was becoming impossible to deny. German tanks might have been better, their planes more advanced, but they were too few. And in modern war, too few meant defeat. In the coming months, German engineers would learn even more. Not from reports, but from wreckage. When they examined downed Allied bombers and tanks, they saw the same pattern repeated: rugged simplicity, easy repair, and the unmistakable hand of mass production. They began to understand that America wasn't fighting with brilliance. It was fighting with abundance. By mid-1943, the German High Command had begun to grasp a terrifying truth. They were no longer fighting against an army, but against an industrial machine. Reports from intelligence officers, U-boat captains, and even prisoners of war all told the same story. American production was accelerating, not slowing down. In occupied Europe, German engineers examined wrecked American bombers and tanks, expecting to find complexity. Instead, they found simplicity, but simplicity perfected. Parts were standardized, maintenance was quick, and materials were chosen for efficiency rather than elegance. The Americans had mastered a kind of mechanical democracy. At Peenemünde, the same minds that developed the V-2 rocket studied fragments of the B-17 and B-24. They marveled at the use of interchangeable rivets, modular panels, and universal fittings. It wasn't art. It was science applied to industry. One Luftwaffe officer wrote in a confidential report, "They have built war into a rhythm. We build machines, they build systems." In Germany, war production was still rooted in craftsmanship. Every tank, every aircraft carried the pride of hand-built precision. But that pride came at a cost. The Tiger tank, for instance, was an engineering masterpiece, but it took 300,000 man-hours to produce. The American M4 Sherman, by contrast, could be assembled in less than a tenth of that time. And while German factories produced hundreds of Tigers, American factories produced tens of thousands of Shermans. The balance of power was tilting, not on the battlefield, but in the foundries. The Americans had turned their factories into engines of victory. Detroit, once the heart of the automobile industry, now became known as the arsenal of democracy. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors stopped producing cars altogether. Instead, they built tanks, jeeps, engines, and bombers on the same assembly lines that had once made sedans. The Germans were astonished by how quickly this transformation had taken place. In less than 2 years, the United States had gone from producing almost no military vehicles to producing more than every Axis nation combined. A captured German officer later admitted, "We never believed a nation of shopkeepers and car builders could become the world's greatest war machine." Meanwhile, German production faltered under relentless Allied bombing. The Ruhr, Hamburg, and Stuttgart, the industrial heart of the Reich, burned night after night. Skilled workers were conscripted, resources were scarce, and fuel was disappearing. Yet across the ocean, America's factories never slept. They ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, powered by endless coal and electricity. While German plants struggled to replace what was lost, America simply built more. When Allied intelligence finally published estimates of American output in 1944, German engineers could scarcely believe them. In that year alone, U.S. industry produced 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany would build in the entire war. The numbers were not just statistics, they were prophecy. For every bomber shot down, 3 more would rise. For every tank destroyed, 5 more would roll off an assembly line somewhere in America. The engineers in Germany began to ask the question no one wanted to answer. Could genius and precision ever stand against scale and speed? And for the first time, the answer seemed clear. In the spring of 1943, deep within the Reich Ministry of Armaments, reports began to circulate that disturbed even the most loyal engineers. Intelligence from the United States revealed not a handful of new factories, but an entire continent transformed into one. The Germans had long prided themselves on discipline, efficiency, and technical mastery. But what they saw in America defied all military logic. Whole cities had become production hubs. Women, once housewives and clerks, were now riveters, welders, and machinists. Assembly lines stretched for miles, filling hangars so vast they seemed to swallow the horizon. One engineer from Messerschmitt, after studying photos of Boeing's Seattle plan, reportedly muttered, "That is not a factory. That is a nation building machines." At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, a new record was being set almost every month. There, the B-24 Liberator bomber, a massive four-engine aircraft, rolled off the line at the rate of 1 per hour. To the Germans, this was beyond comprehension. In Europe, a single aircraft of that complexity could take weeks or even months to assemble. But the Americans had turned aircraft production into something closer to magic. An orchestra of men and machines working in perfect unison. A Luftwaffe analyst described it bluntly. "They are building faster than we can shoot them down." And it wasn't just the aircraft. Tank factories like Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal plant produced M4 Shermans by the thousands. Henry Ford's industrial philosophy, standardization, mass production, and interchangeability, was now feeding an entire war. In contrast, the German war economy was shackled by old thinking. Tanks like the Tiger and Panther were built in limited numbers by specialized craftsmen. They were powerful, but they were also fragile and irreplaceable once lost. One German engineer later admitted, "We built masterpieces for a museum. They built machines for an army." As the war dragged on, the imbalance grew impossible to ignore. German factories could not keep up. Materials were scarce, supply lines crippled by bombing, and the workforce stretched to exhaustion. Yet across the ocean, American industry only grew faster, stronger, more organized. Even after the devastating losses of 1942, when the Allies struggled in North Africa and the Pacific, American factories never paused. If anything, those setbacks only drove production harder. By 1944, the U.S. was outproducing the Axis powers combined, not just in weapons, but in everything that made modern warfare possible. Trucks, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, uniforms, food. It was then that German intelligence officers began using a grim phrase in their reports, Materialkrieg, or the War of Materials. It was a war that Germany could never win. They had underestimated their enemy not in courage or tactics, but in capacity. While German leaders boasted of quality, America had quietly mastered quantity and made it unstoppable. When Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots flew over Allied convoys in the Atlantic, they reported something chilling. Ships as far as the eye could see, stretching across the ocean in perfect formation. Each one carried the proof of American industrial might: steel, fuel, aircraft parts, and tanks bound for Europe. And as one German observer later said, "When we looked down at that endless line of ships, we knew it was not our pilots or our tanks that would lose this war. It was our factories." By mid-1943, German engineers began receiving captured Allied equipment from the front lines: tanks, aircraft engines, even jeeps. Each was sent to testing centers in Germany for analysis. What they found there only deepened their sense of unease. The Allied machines were not refined, but they were relentless. The American M4 Sherman tank, for instance, lacked the heavy armor and massive guns of the German Tiger or Panther. But when the engineers at Kummersdorf examined it, they realized its true advantage wasn't in combat power, it was in design simplicity. Every bolt, every plate, every component was standardized. Any damaged Sherman could be repaired using parts from another, often within hours. The Germans could hardly believe it. Their own tanks required hand-fitted components, unique to each machine, often built by master craftsmen. One engineer reportedly remarked, The Americans can lose 10 tanks and replace them tomorrow. We lose one and feel it for months. The same revelation came from captured aircraft. German technicians disassembled P-47 Thunderbolts and B-24 Liberators and were stunned to find how easily they were built. Modular, practical, designed to be produced by unskilled labor in massive quantities. A report from a Luftwaffe technical officer described the discovery. It is not art. It is industry, and it terrifies us to the Germans, whose engineering culture was built on precision and perfection. This was an entirely different way of thinking, a philosophy that valued speed, efficiency, and adaptability over elegance. They also began to realize the scale of what they were facing. By 1943, American industry was producing over 85,000 aircraft per year. By contrast, the entire Luftwaffe, the pride of Germany, could only build a fraction of that, and the gap kept growing. At a secret meeting in Berlin, Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, reviewed the latest intelligence reports. They showed American production numbers that dwarfed anything seen before in human history. Speer wrote later in his memoirs, "We had always believed that our superiority in design could overcome any numerical disadvantage, but now I saw that even the best machine is nothing if it cannot be replaced." As German engineers struggled to improve production, they faced another truth. Allied bombing raids were crippling their capacity. The factories at Kassel, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg burned under waves of B-17 and B-24 bombers. The very same aircraft they had once dismissed as crude. Each time they rebuilt, more bombs fell. Production slowed. Morale crumbled. Meanwhile, in America, new factories were opening every month. The Ford River Rouge complex alone employed more workers than some entire German cities. At Boeing, women and men worked around the clock under fluorescent lights, turning out aircraft wings by the thousands. German engineers began referring to this unstoppable production as Die Amerikanische Flut, the American flood. They could design a Tiger tank that terrified Allied crews, but they could not build enough of them to matter. The Allies could lose hundreds of Shermans and still have more arriving the next morning. It was an industrial avalanche, one that no amount of engineering genius could hold back. In a report sent to Berlin in late 1943, a captured American poster was attached as evidence of the enemy's mindset. It showed a factory worker tightening a bolt on a tank with the caption, "Every turn counts toward victory." For the first time, the Germans began to understand that this was not just a war of soldiers. It was a war of workers, fought not only in the trenches, but in the foundries. One German engineer summed it up with quiet despair. "We had the best craftsmen, they had the best factories, and factories win wars." By early 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. One Germany was never prepared to fight. The front lines were no longer just in the fields of France or the snows of Russia. They were in the skies, in the shipyards, and in the endless rows of American factories stretching from Detroit to Seattle. German engineers and officers who once prided themselves on precision craftsmanship now faced an enemy that built faster than anyone in history. Reports arriving at the Reich Air Ministry described what seemed impossible. American factories completing an aircraft every few minutes. At Willow Run, the Ford Motor Company's massive plant in Michigan, a new B-24 Liberator rolled off the assembly line every 63 minutes. At peak efficiency, more than 8,500 of the bombers were built there, a number that left German analysts speechless. One Luftwaffe report dryly noted, "They build bombers as if they are automobiles." It wasn't just speed that shocked them. It was the coordination. In Germany, production was scattered, hampered by politics, rivalry, and Allied bombing. But in America, factories operated like a single organism. Aircraft parts made in California arrived in Ohio the same week. Engines built in Detroit powered planes assembled in Texas. This level of organization was something the German war machine, fractured by bureaucracy and ideology, could never replicate. In his post-war memoirs, Albert Speer wrote with candid frustration, "The Americans could outbuild us not because they were cleverer, but because they were free of interference. Their industrialists worked for victory, not for prestige." Captured German pilots who were later shown Allied factories after the war often described the experience with disbelief. One Luftwaffe veteran said, "It was as if they had weaponized their cities. Everywhere you looked, machines, workers, motion. It never stopped." In a single year, American plants built more aircraft than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined had produced since the start of the war. And yet the true shock came when they saw the workers themselves. Women in coveralls, young men too old or too young for the front, African American laborers working side by side with immigrants from across the nation. To German eyes conditioned by propaganda that glorified purity and hierarchy, it was incomprehensible. Yet this diversity was part of America's strength. It fueled the war effort with unity and purpose. In 1944, as Allied bombers darkened the skies over Europe, German engineers realized they were no longer fighting the same kind of war. Their factories, no matter how efficient, were finite, their materials dwindling, their workers exhausted. But America's war industry seemed limitless. From Pittsburgh's steel mills to the oil fields of Texas, everything was connected. Everything fed the machine. One German intelligence officer, writing in frustration, called it a war against a factory that never sleeps. Even more astonishing was the replacement rate. A U.S. fighter squadron that lost 10 aircraft in combat could be fully re-equipped in days. A German squadron that suffered the same losses might wait weeks, or never recover at all. This imbalance broke the rhythm of the Luftwaffe. Skilled pilots were left grounded while their opponents returned to the skies, again and again. The German engineers could admire the craftsmanship of their own machines. The sleek lines of the Focke-Wulf 190, the advanced technology of the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. But they knew it no longer mattered. Perfection could not defeat production. One weary designer at Messerschmitt was quoted saying, "They build imperfect planes perfectly. We build perfect planes imperfectly." By the middle of 1944, the truth was undeniable. The war had become a contest of endurance, and Germany was running out of breath. Even as engineers continued to push boundaries, developing jet aircraft and guided weapons, they knew the tide could not be turned. The enemy's strength was not just in the air. It was in the rhythm of the assembly lines, the roar of steel presses, and the hands of millions who never saw the front but shaped its outcome. For every German innovation, the Americans answered with abundance. And in the end, abundance would decide the war. By the summer of 1944, even the most optimistic German engineers could no longer deny the scale of what they were facing. The Allies had achieved something that defied every principle of wartime production: quantity without chaos. American factories were building faster than bombs could destroy, faster than Germany could even respond. The statistics were staggering. In 1944 alone, the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft, more than 5 times what the Luftwaffe managed that year. For every German tank that rolled out of a workshop, American assembly lines delivered 10 Shermans. The ratio wasn't just a number, it was the difference between survival and annihilation. At the Krupp and Messerschmitt design bureaus, engineers began studying Allied production models. They examined captured reports, photographs, even blueprints smuggled from North Africa and Italy. What they found was unsettling: simplicity. Where the Germans used precision machine parts and specialized labor, the Americans favored standardized components, interchangeable fittings, and machines that could be built anywhere, by anyone. One report from the German Armaments Ministry summed it up bluntly: the Americans build not as craftsmen, but as organizers. Their genius is in management. German field commanders began noticing it on the front lines. Entire Allied divisions seemed to move with mechanical precision. Tanks repaired overnight, trucks replaced within hours, airstrikes coordinated with terrifying efficiency. It wasn't luck, it was logistics. To German officers, raised in the tradition of elite excellence, it was bewildering. They had been trained to believe that quality would always triumph over quantity. But the war had shifted into a new age, one where the assembly line was as powerful as the gun. When the Allies landed in Normandy, the industrial difference became impossible to ignore. The Germans fought with courage and tactical brilliance, but the enemy's supply chain was inexhaustible. Trucks unloaded food, ammunition, and fuel directly from ships. New tanks arrived daily, Damaged vehicles were towed to mobile repair depots that worked day and night. By contrast, Germany's logistics were collapsing. Factories lay in ruins from Allied bombing raids. Railways were crippled. Fuel shortages grounded even the most advanced aircraft. Albert Speer later wrote, "We could build a tank, but not the fuel to move it. They could build both, and they built them faster." In one particularly revealing moment, German engineers at Augsburg analyzed captured components from an American P-51 Mustang. They noted the lightweight materials, the modular assembly, and the remarkable consistency of the parts, whether the plane had been built in Texas, California, or New York. One senior engineer remarked, "They could lose a factory, and another would produce the same part without delay. We could lose one, and the whole chain would break." That was the truth of the American advantage: resilience through replication. In the depths of underground bunkers, German planners scrambled to adapt. They tried to imitate the assembly line method, consolidating production under the so-called Spear program. But by then, it was too late. There was no steel left to spare, no fuel to transport, no workforce untouched by war. Meanwhile, American industry had become a force of nature. At peak output, a Liberty ship, a full-size cargo vessel, was launched every 3 days. One German naval officer, upon reading the report, shook his head in disbelief and said, "We sink them faster than anyone else in history. And yet the sea fills with more." Every week, the war had become a race of momentum, and Germany was falling behind with every passing hour. Even their most advanced weapons, jet fighters, heavy tanks, V-weapons, could not offset the relentless flood of Allied material power. When German intelligence analysts compiled their final reports in late 1944, the conclusion was devastating. The Americans have achieved the impossible. They have made industry into a weapon greater than any cannon. It was no longer a matter of tactics or technology. It was a matter of time. For every tank destroyed, 10 more appeared. For every bomber shot down, 5 more took its place. Germany had entered a war of exhaustion, and America had built a machine that never tired. By early 1945, the full might of American industry had revealed itself, not just in numbers, but in rhythm. German prisoners of war, captured on the Western Front, spoke of seeing endless convoys rolling past them. Trucks, tanks, bulldozers, jeeps, an ocean of steel in motion stretching from horizon to horizon. What they didn't realize was that behind that wave stood something far more powerful than any army: a system. In Detroit, once the heart of the automobile industry, the factories that had produced sedans and coupes were now turning out Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant became a legend, the world's first true airplane factory. At its peak, it produced a completed B-24 every 63 minutes. To the Germans, this was incomprehensible. They could build superb aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190, the Messerschmitt 262, but they could not match the Americans' pace. Each German plane was the product of artisanship. Each American one was the product of organization. One Luftwaffe engineer reportedly said, "We build eagles, they build flocks." The secret was not only in scale, but in cooperation. Across the United States, thousands of subcontractors, small factories, workshops, even family businesses, were tied into a vast logistical network. Components made in one city would arrive by rail at another, ready for assembly without delay. This interconnected web meant that no single bombing raid, no single sabotage could stop production. The German intelligence service eventually realized that the American arsenal of democracy was too decentralized to destroy. A captured German industrial report, dated late 1944, concluded, "They do not build in one place. They build everywhere." Meanwhile, the German war machine was imploding under its own weight. Allied bombers had crippled the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the Reich. Coal shipments were delayed, steel output was halved, and factories operated only at night to avoid detection. The once mighty Messerschmitt works at Regensburg were in ruins, and yet reports from the front told of more Allied aircraft than ever before, more tanks, more trucks. It was as if the Americans were manufacturing faster than destruction itself. When German engineers examined captured American vehicles, jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks, they found a common theme: efficiency. The machines were not elegant, but they were easy to repair. Parts could be swapped, engines replaced, gearboxes modified, all with minimal tools. One Wehrmacht mechanic, captured in Normandy, later said in an interview, "If we had their trucks, we would never have lost Russia." The Allies had built an ecosystem of mobility. Each vehicle fed into the next. Trucks carried supplies, tanks carried victory, and factories carried the war across oceans. The Germans had believed in brilliance. The Americans had believed in systems. And those systems were now unstoppable. By 1945, German officers were being shown intelligence photographs of American production centers, the scale of which defied comprehension. Entire cities of factories, rivers lined with shipyards, railways so vast they made Europe's infrastructure look medieval. One officer wrote bitterly in his diary, "We were fighting a nation that could build faster than we could think." Even Hitler himself began to grasp the magnitude of the industrial disaster. In his final months, he demanded new miracle weapons: the jet fighter, the rocket, the supertank, anything that could reverse the tide. But no miracle could replace what Germany had already lost: the ability to mass produce. Albert Speer, the armaments minister, would later confess, "The Americans had turned war into mathematics. They built faster, cheaper, and smarter." We never understood that by the spring of 1945, the evidence was everywhere. American tanks rolled through shattered cities, their engines rumbling with the sound of inevitability. Above them, bombers, thousands of them, flew in perfect formation, casting shadows over a defeated land. It wasn't just firepower that had broken Germany, it was production. The German engineers, who once laughed at American overproduction, now saw the truth: that speed, standardization, and sheer scale had reshaped warfare forever. The age of the craftsman was over. The age of the machine had won. By the time 1945 reached its violent crescendo, the German engineers who once mocked America's mass production could only watch in disbelief. The factories they had dismissed as crude and unsophisticated had overwhelmed their nation's finest craftsmanship. The American way of building, fast, modular, and standardized, had proven stronger than even the most advanced designs of the Reich. Captured German industrial officers were interrogated in the ruins of Europe. Many spoke candidly. They admitted they had underestimated not just American factories, but the entire philosophy behind them. The German mindset had been shaped by precision and perfection. Each aircraft, tank, and weapon was a masterpiece, built to last, built with care. But that came at a cost: time. Every modification required hand-fitting, every replacement part had to match perfectly. It was engineering brilliance trapped in its own pride. Meanwhile, in America, perfection meant something different. It meant reliability at scale. It meant parts so standardized that any soldier, anywhere, could replace them. The result was a military machine that didn't rely on a few experts, but on millions of ordinary workers, each performing one small vital task in a vast, unstoppable system. When German engineers were shown photographs of American assembly lines after the war, some reportedly fell silent. The images were staggering: endless rows of tanks, aircraft, and engines stretching across factory floors the size of towns. At Ford's Willow Run plant, workers had built over 8,600 B-24 bombers. At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, more than 22,000 tanks rolled off the line. The Kaiser shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every few days. One German engineer later wrote in a post-war report, "The American secret weapon was not a plane or a tank. It was their factory." This realization shook the foundation of German military thought. During the war, German officers often believed that superior design could compensate for limited resources. The Tiger tank, for instance, was a marvel of engineering: powerful, heavily armored, and nearly indestructible. But it took weeks to build one. The Americans could build a dozen Shermans in the same time, each one simpler, lighter, but easily repaired and replaced. On the battlefield, numbers began to tell their own truth. As one captured Panzer commander put it, "We killed one, and two more came." It was like fighting a flood after the war, when German engineers were brought to Allied facilities under Operation Paperclip and similar programs. Many were astonished by what they saw firsthand. The scale of logistics, the precision of mass assembly, the coordination between factories and front lines. It was like discovering a new form of warfare. One former Luftwaffe engineer, when shown an American logistics map linking factories from coast to coast, reportedly said, "No wonder we lost. We never fought an army. We fought an industry." In the ruins of Germany as rebuilding began, these same engineers started to apply what they had learned. They began to adopt American-style production systems, modular manufacturing, conveyor-based assembly, and standardization. Ironically, the lessons learned from defeat helped rebuild West Germany into one of the world's great industrial powers in the post-war decades. But they never forgot what had humbled them. The memory of America's vast production, of tanks rolling from factories like bread from an oven, lingered as a lesson in the power of efficiency. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, summed it up simply: Germany built for excellence, America built for endurance. And in the end, endurance always wins. For the German engineers, the war had revealed more than a military defeat. It had revealed a new kind of civilization, one that could turn cities into engines, engines into armies, and workers into the architects of victory. They had laughed once when they saw the crude designs of American machinery. But by 1945, they weren't laughing anymore. They were learning. When the war finally ended, the silence that settled over Europe was heavy, not just with loss, but with realization. The German engineers, scientists, and industrial planners who survived the conflict were left with a single haunting truth. They had been defeated not merely by weapons, but by production itself. In the shattered cities of Germany, factories lay in rubble. The once proud centers of precision engineering, Essen, Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, were blackened shells. But across the Atlantic, the American industrial machine that had fueled the war effort continued to run. Its furnaces still burned, its assembly lines still moved. What had taken Europe years to produce, America could build in months. For German engineers, the contrast was staggering. They had built for mastery, America had built for momentum. One captured industrial planner confessed to Allied interrogators, "We could design the best machine in the world, but they could build 1,000 good ones before we finished one." The sheer scale of the American system became clear during the Allied occupation. German specialists were invited to tour American-controlled facilities. They saw warehouses filled with spare parts, rail cars packed with engines, and shipyards still launching vessels long after victory had been declared. What struck them most was not the abundance, but the organization. Every nut, bolt, and barrel had a place. The entire industrial network functioned like a living organism, feeding, moving, adapting. It wasn't chaos, it was coordination on a scale the Germans had never imagined possible. In the years after 1945, as Germany began to rebuild, those same engineers carried these lessons home. They studied how American factories used interchangeable parts, standardized designs, and conveyor systems that minimized human error. The new German industry that emerged, from Volkswagen to Siemens, was built not just on precision, but on adaptability. It was the fusion of two worlds, German craftsmanship and American mass production. Together, they became the foundation of modern industry. But behind the post-war progress lingered memories of awe and of humiliation. During the war, German officers had mocked the crude Shermans, the loud flying fortresses, the clumsy Liberty ships. They had believed that no nation so focused on quantity could possibly match their engineering genius. Yet in the end, it was that very quantity, multiplied by efficiency, powered by workers, and guided by logistics, that had drowned them. As one Luftwaffe engineer admitted years later, "We thought war was a contest of innovation. It was really a contest of production." The lesson was clear. In the age of total war, brilliance without scale was doomed. The Americans had shown that strength lay not in a single machine, but in the power to build endlessly, to replace, to repair, to outlast. Even Albert Speer, Hitler's own armaments minister acknowledged in his prison writings that Germany never truly understood the magnitude of what it faced. He wrote, "The Americans built war as if it were industry itself. Their victory was not in battle. It was in the factory." By the dawn of the Cold War, many of those same German engineers found themselves working under new flags in the United States, Britain, and later West Germany, helping to build the next generation of aircraft, vehicles, and infrastructure. They carried with them not only the scars of defeat, but the lessons of it. They had learned that the future did not belong to those who built the finest machines, but to those who could build enough of them to change the course of history. In the end, the laughter that had once filled the Luftwaffe hangars in German design halls, the laughter that mocked America's clumsy machines and mass production, fell silent. Because when the skies burned and the factories thundered and the world itself was reshaped by industry, they finally understood. The Americans hadn't just built weapons, they had built victory. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.